I'm Mark Golden. I'm president of the Wagner Society of Washington, D.C. And on behalf of our chairman, Jim Holman, and the entire board, we're delighted to see you here for what I know will be a very deeply engaging presentation. I'm obliged to do a little bit of promotion and tell you in February, we'll have a Zoom meeting with one of our regular and most beloved speakers, Saul Launius, talking about Tristan the Hero. So this may be a little less musically focused than what we normally hear from Saul, but I'm sure will be interesting. Then in March, we will have an event here, our annual Wagner in the Movies. The film has not yet been selected, but that is always a fun thing. Then coming up in April, also here, we have Alexander Jacob, who will be doing a concert piano transcription of The Ring. Obviously not all 15 hours of it, but a more manageable chunk of that, something we will enjoy. And also looking a little bit further ahead to June 11th through the 14th is our annual retreat, Wagner in der Wildnis, at the Caton State Park in West Virginia. Always a fun weekend, and in response to feedback from attendees, we have added an optional additional night on the front end if you want to come early and spend time socializing informally with Jeffrey Swan and Simon Williams and sort of get yourself eased into a weekend of Wagner. As always, we appreciate the generosity of our attendees. It has been a principle of the Wagner Society of Washington since its start to make virtually all of our programs open and free to the public, but they are not free to produce. And so if you are a member, thank you. If you're not a member, please consider helping us out along those lines. End of commercial, on with the show. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker, Thomas Launius. Interesting backstory. Born into a military family, spent his early life all over Europe and Japan and the US. Before, I'm not making this up, going to university in Louisiana with a major in physics and a minor in vocal performance. I can guess which ones your parents were encouraging you to do. But he does have a career and experience as a vocal performer, as well as a scholar. He now resides in Bavaria, just outside of Munich. And if you've ever gone to Neuschwanstein or any of the castles, you may very well have seen him. He conducts some of the most highly... I was not able to use him, but he was highly recommended to me the first time I was able to visit the Wagner castles in Bavaria. So I hope that the next time I'll certainly take you up on that. But we will go forward now with Parsifal sources and mythologies.
Thank you very much for the introduction. It's my privilege to be with you here this evening. As we begin, I would like to give you greetings from the Münchner Richard Wagner Verband, from the Richard Wagner Society in Munich. We are not quite the oldest society in the world. Vienna beat us to the punch. Our society goes back to 1873. So I give you greetings from our society and from our president, Karl Ruswarm, and it's my privilege to be here with you this evening. As Mark has already alluded to, I live in Bavaria, just south of Munich, and thought I'd say a word or two about how I came to know Wagner. As he mentioned, as I was at university, I was trained in the bel canto style of singing. I was an operatic tenor. For 5 years, I sang opera. My voice professor in the voice faculty was Dr. V. William Reed, from New York City, and we were so proud to have him down there in Louisiana. Although I should assure you that although I sang opera, I was not a star, nor anywhere near a star. I only sang in the chorus, or had a very small role, or sometimes was the understudy. During that period of time, towards the end of it, I realized I was not good enough, and I never would be. That's not easy to come to terms with, but I realized that was the truth, and so I reluctantly left that world. I kept my love of music, however, and my vocal training and my musical background, and my love of opera. However, I must admit that my love of Wagner was more, of opera was more in the lyrical realm, the Italian realm. Although certainly I knew about Wagner, I was really not a devotee of him and did not really know anything about his operas. That changed 8 years ago when I moved to Bavaria, near Munich, and quickly began to lead tours to this place, the Neuschwanstein Castle. And of course, I quickly learned that it was built by Ludwig II of Bavaria as an homage to Wagner. I also quickly learned that the entire castle is populated through the paintings on the walls and the decorations in the rooms, dedicated to all of the stories that were turned into operas by Wagner. Here is Lohengrin. You probably recognize this. This is in the castle. This is Tristan and Isolde. And this is Parsifal on Good Friday. I also learned that many of the compositional strategies that Wagner used in his operas, Ludwig found a way to incorporate into the architectural details of his castle. For example, the concept of Gesamtkunstwerk, the total work of art, is embodied in each room through its total dedication to that room's story. In addition, endless melody is embodied in the castle through the endless decorations. And then finally, even Wagner's unique use of the orchestra to express the repressed subconscious of the singers on the stage is also incorporated into each room. As I learned these things about the castle, I thought to myself, I really should go see an opera by Wagner. So I must admit, maybe some of you have been steeped in Wagner for 40 years or more. I'm kind of a Johnny-come-lately, just the last 5 years. But once I began to realize what he was doing and understood the unity within the complexity of his music, I was hooked. And so it's my honor to be with you this day, talking about something I especially love, with my background in mythology and my background in music and my knowledge of Parsifal. I'd like to begin with a quote from Vasily Kandinsky. Vasily Kandinsky was a Russian who moved to Germany, was a painter, was pivotal in the late 19th century, the first half of the 20th century, in moving late Impressionism art to full-blown abstract art. He, like Wagner, wrote essays about his theories, and one of them is this one, Über das Geistige in der Kunst. And this is the very first line in that book. Jedes Kunstwerk ist Kind seiner Zeit. Every work of art is the child of its time. Vasily went on to develop this understanding that every era in human experience has its own particular zeitgeist, its own particular spirit of its age. It's the artist's calling, and indeed his greatest joy and burden, to discover what that zeitgeist is. However, not to discover it outside of himself or herself out in the culture, but rather to discover it from within as an inner necessity. And then to express that inner necessity through their art. Realizing that the people of his or her time may not recognize their own zeitgeist. In other words, The artist, in expressing the inner necessity he or she has discovered within, is going inevitably to receive resistance and misunderstanding. But it is their calling to persist nevertheless and to embody the zeitgeist of their era. If they are able to fulfill that, then they have fulfilled their calling as an artist. At the same time, Vasily understood that every artist, it was his or her duty to fulfill the zeitgeist of their age, but they must accept as well the limitation of their age, that they would never be able to exceed or surpass the spirit of their age. It was enough for them to fulfill it, and then to let their art go and let succeeding generations have their turn. It is in this spirit of what Vasily Kandinsky had to say that I would like for us to share our time together today. It will be my honor to accompany you this evening as together we explore Wagner's Parsifal. Let's talk about what's going to happen during this presentation. I'm going to give all of you this evening some foundational definitions to make sure we're all on the same page. I'm then going to go on to talk about something called source criticism, and we're going to apply that to how Wagner adapted the source, Wolfram von Eschenbach. Here he is, Parsifal, 1206. Wolfram von Eschenbach, the Bavarian, living near Nuremberg, 50,000 lines of poetry long in heroic rhyming couplets. This is the basis that Wagner used in the creation of his opera. So we're going to look at how Wagner adapted Wolfram von Eschenbach in the creation of his own opera. We're going to learn how Wagner inserted 2 fairy tales in order to make everything work. We're going to explore how Wagner created what I call an aesthetic, archaic register, his own particular version of German for the language in his opera. We're going to talk about how Wagner interiorized, psychologized Eschenbach's opera. Then we're going to sum it up. And then in addition, there will be regular pauses during my presentation, every 12 to 15 minutes or so, for me to entertain your questions. With that as our beginning, let us have our foundational definitions. We begin with mythos. Mythos in Greek is myth in English. Oftentimes in our current culture, we automatically assume myth means, oh, something that's not really true. But the ancient Greeks understood mythos, myth, in their own special way. They understood that myth had its own particular truth, what we today might call non-analytic truth. So a myth is a meaning-bearing story that shapes identity, desire, suffering, and vocation. It describes the nature of reality, and it organizes human experience. It is non-analytic truth. The Greeks paired it with analytic truth that they called logos. They believed that both mythos and logos were truth, but they operated differently. Mythos was narrative truth, logos was rational truth, but they both were truth. Religion. What is a religion? A religion is a structure that organizes itself around a myth, and it has any number of practices. It makes use of doctrines, sacred texts, holy places, ordained leaders, rituals, communal life, and ethical standards. There's a relationship between myth and religion. They're not the same, but they are related to one another. Myth is the narrative heart of a religion. Without a myth, there is no religion. Religion is the protective structure that grows up around a myth. Sometimes I say that a religion is the bureaucracy that grows up around a myth to protect it, promote it, extend it, defend it, explain it, and so forth. Mythogenesis. Mythogenesis is the way in which a story, by the way, we all live in stories. You have your own life story, do you not? All around us are stories all the time. That does not necessarily turn them into a myth. In a sense, a myth is a story that has gained energy through a community, that it has grown up, has won their hearts, and it has become prominent in their lives. Mythogenesis is the gradual, organic process through which a story gains the energy and the support, as it were, to become a myth that now has power in a large group of people. Mythogenesis. Mythopoeia is the deliberate creation of a new myth, typically by a great mind or an artist or a poet, a creator, where an individual in a specific moment in time gathers together various stories, mythic elements, energy, and so forth, and presto changeo, creates a new myth that then has power and persuasive presence for people. European storytelling tradition. This is key. In early Europe, communal memory was carried orally by professional storytellers. By the way, this continued even after the early ages of Europe. It always was the case that people had an appetite for professional storytellers. In the later life of Europe, they became somewhat isolated. In the early phases of Europe, when people were pre-literate, this was the only way the community could have memory that lasted more than one generation. So in early Europe, communal memory was carried orally by professional storytellers. These storytellers didn't just learn their craft willy-nilly. They were intensively trained, decades long or longer, very rigorous memorization of large bodies of traditional material. They were trained to preserve the core or the essence of every story, but to feel free to use their own particular style and personality in the telling of that story, and to shape that story, sometimes on the fly, to fit a particular audience in a particular context. Oftentimes later in the world of folkloric studies, this was known as the matter and the sense. The matter of a story is its core, that is non-negotiable. The sense is the freedom of the storyteller to adapt it for an occasion. These storytellers learned that, in essence, there were no new stories, at least not new stories that somehow appeared out of nowhere. Instead, they understood that stories were created out of previous stories. So they learned how to borrow apart from this story, and apart from this story, and apart from this story, and to put it together in a new kind of synthesis so that it had new regenerative energy, but it was not completely just created ex nihilo. In addition, professional storytellers never appeared before a group simply to tell one story and then walk away. They would tell one after another, after another, after another. Even if they appeared to have no relationship to one another, the fact that one followed another would oftentimes create what we today would call a kind of meta-narrative, an overarching narrative that somehow mysteriously flowed through all of the stories. So, for example, if the professional storyteller was telling fairy tales, maybe the first one was about a woman in a deep sleep because of a poisoned apple. And then the next story might be about 3 brothers and 3 feathers. And then the next story might be about a woman with no hands. They all had different characters, different storylines, and yet somehow they seemed to all fit and flow together. This was the European storytelling tradition. The creation or generation of religious polarities. Mythologists and studying cultures down through the centuries have discovered that cultures automatically have this propensity for generating religious polarities. And here's what they are. They have a dominant religion. This religion appears to be in control of the culture. They have the greatest energy, the greatest power, the greatest say over things, the greatest number of followers. They established the dominant religion, the rules of the order, the values, the identity of the people. But that culture never has only that dominant culture, dominant religion and none other. Instead, what the dominant energy cannot integrate or cannot address, especially dealing with the most difficult aspects of human life, the body, eros, nature, suffering, and power, these tend to fall outside of the authorized framework of the dominant religion. And what happens is these excluded dimensions reappear in other forms within that culture, either as art, as mysticism, as heterodox religion, or as countercultural religious movements. The relationship between the dominant religion and these, we'll call them subdominant religions, is unstable and complex. Sometimes they just avoid each other, sometimes they fight, sometimes they actually mutually transform and enhance one another. You just never know. It can change moment by moment. The Grail legend. The Grail legend, by the way, operated in the European culture as one of these subdominant aspects of the culture. It existed in a sense to try to compensate for some of the things that were not being addressed by the dominant religion, Roman Catholic Christianity. The Grail legend is a recurring mythic tradition within the European culture that blends Celtic myth, Christian mysticism, and chivalric ideals into a quest for spiritual transformation. There are evidences of the Grail legend going back 1,500 years in Europe. We see the first beginnings of a proto-Grail legend around the 5th century. It's not yet a cohesive narrative, but rather the elements are all there. The Celtic bowl of plenty that gives unending sustenance to the people. The wounded king who causes his kingdom to become a wasteland. And legends about this chalice brought to Europe from the Holy Land connected with the Savior Jesus Christ. By the 5th century, all of those elements are there swimming around inside the European culture. By around the year 800 or 900, they coalesced into a coherent narrative, but only being transmitted orally. It's in the 13th, 12th, and 13th centuries that the great flowering, this was not the time when the Grail legend was created, the 12th and 13th centuries, but the time when they were finally written down. And so oftentimes we tend to date the Grail legend to that time in Europe, but they were there long before that. So the Grail legend is something that's been operating in the European culture for 1,500 years. Finally, a quote from our own Wagner. The incomparable thing about myth is that it is always true, and its content, through utmost compression, is inexhaustible for all time. I want to touch on source criticism, because this is going to be the major tool that we're going to use today to tinker around inside Wagner's opera. Source criticism was first developed in the late 18th century by German Protestant biblical scholars. They developed it because they finally had gotten free of a strictly devotional reading of the Bible and began to look at it simply as a document. In other words, they began to take a kind of analytical or scientific approach to the scriptures. It began with these Protestant biblical scholars, but didn't stay there very long. Scholars in other literary fields, the ancients, Greek and Rome, Shakespeare and others, quickly realized a powerful tool, shall we say, had been found that could help open up meaning in a text that never had been easily discovered before. One thing that source criticism does is it reveals how meaning is made. In other words, the document is no longer treated as something inviolable, so sacred you could never touch it or question it, but rather you begin to analyze it very, very carefully and find out just how in the world does it work. What it also does is it distinguishes inheritance from invention. Especially when you compare a text to its source, then you can quickly say, oh, this part of the text we find in the source. Oh, but this part we don't. What is going on there? It also helps situate a text historically and objectively rather than mythically. So it gives a person a more down-to-earth, objective view of just what a text is doing. And one of the most powerful things it does is it exposes ideological and psychological shifts. When the text you're studying has a very different emotional world from the original text, it stands out in great relief when you have the two to compare to one another. It also deepens interpretation without lessening the artistry it took for that person to create the revealed text that you're studying. And one last thing that's golden, and by the way, this is what made this particular strategy so useful to the biblical scholars, because they actually knew very little about the various authors of the Old and New Testaments. The source criticism method produces results that are totally independent of the author. You don't need to know anything at all about them in order to discover a lot of rich, deeper meaning in the text when you use this strategy. The text we will be using for comparison this evening. In the world of source criticism, there's something called the received text. That means this is the text we are studying. We take it at face value, exactly for what it is, nothing more, nothing less. For us this evening, that will be Richard Wagner's Parsifal libretto from 1877. That's the received text. The source text is this. Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parsifal, 1206. And by the way, I use an abbreviation oftentimes for Wolfram von Eschenbach because it's so long. So whenever you see the WVE, you'll know who I'm referring to. Now, along the way in comparing the texts, the source criticism method must look very analytically at both texts. And it does the following things. When it compares the two texts, or even when it's analyzing a single standalone text, it is looking for structural changes. When does the structure of the text change, if ever? That's very important. Another thing it looks for is something called changes in register. Is it formal? Is it informal? Is it judicial? Is it emotional? Is it social? What is the current register of the text? And when that changes, aha, that's something to pay attention to. It looks for changes in grammar or syntax. If for a while the text has a lot of long, rambling sentences, and then suddenly they become short and punchy, you pay attention to that. Something's going on. You look for changes in vocabulary and diction. If suddenly the words that are being used change, you see words you haven't seen in the text before, or you see words repeated over and over again, that's something to pay attention to. You look for changes in style, how the text is being formed. You look for changes in tone or emotion. Is it happy, then sad, then angry, then frightened? What is the tone of the text? You look for changes in the characters in the story. Do they exhibit different levels of agency or of behavior? You also, as I said earlier, you look for words or phrases that repeat because that signifies importance. It also can signify that each time it's being used in a different way, and you're looking for how that is continually shifting. And then finally, you also look for what is missing. If there are things in the source text that are not in the received text, that's also something to flag. So source criticism is always looking for all of these things all the time. And as we'll see as our talk proceeds this evening, many fruitful insights can come. But with that as a sort of introduction, I'll entertain your questions now. What questions might you have? Yes, sir.
Yes, I noticed you're using British spellings. But my question, so I can understand the oral tradition. Think of ancient Greece, Homer, who may have been a person or an acronym for a whole bunch of people over many years. But I get the sense you're talking about Northern Europeans. Maybe Northern Europeans before civilization arrived with the Romans and medieval and whenever civilization arrived in Northern Europe. Can you give a sense of the particular places you're talking about in this oral tradition of storytellers? Are these Greek and Roman storytellers, or are these German and Scandinavian storytellers?
Yes, thank you. Very good question. What we have learned by studying European culture is that storytelling was endemic. It was widespread, it was omnipresent, it was everywhere. We could refer to one particular example quickly, the Grimm's Brothers fairy tales. Fairy tales that, by the way, are not only Germanic. Every culture in the world has fairy tales. But the Germanic fairy tales began in the oral tradition, were circulated. The brothers Grimm, Jakob and Wilhelm, in the early 19th century, went around the rural villages of Germany, talking to farm wives and local people and whatnot, and asking them, what was that story that you tell each other? And they wrote it down. So the fairy tale storytelling tradition was active throughout the German-speaking world. In addition, we have copious evidences of storytelling in the Celtic tradition. We know about that with the Irish bards. Well, guess what? The Celts were in Bavaria. The Celtic culture actually began in Bavaria. Wolfgang von Eschenbach was a Bavarian, still influenced by Celtic culture centuries later. So, yes, without question, the storytelling tradition was present throughout Europe in all times and even persisted after people became literate. Yes. Other questions? Yes.
Yeah, there's something I'm confused by. I might not have heard correctly, but you mentioned source criticism as arising with Protestantism, and how was that different from the source criticism of the Talmudic scholars that goes back to the beginning, say, the 2nd century, if not earlier, much earlier,
Yeah.
in many different places?
Yeah. I have to say I'm not an expert on Talmudic interpretation of Scripture. So I don't know in what way they did that interpretation, whether it was the kind of rigorous source criticism that the Protestants did.
Okay, I think about schools.
Yeah, oh, I know, exactly. You're right, they had schools of interpretation, absolutely. But I don't know if they did the kind of source criticism that the Protestant biblical scholars did. Certainly, it was true that the form of source criticism that came into Central Europe flowed into Europe through those biblical scholars to begin with, and then spread out to other disciplines. Okay, other questions?
What about the role of song in transmitting these stories, troubadours?
Very good, yes. The role of song, these professional storytellers, the stories were very carefully crafted to make them easier to memorize. They oftentimes use alliteration, or they use rhyme, or they use rhythm. And of course, the best way to memorize a story is with song. And so in many ways, around the same time that Eschenbach is writing down his version of Parsifal, the Minnesänger, that's the German word, or the troubadours, the French singers, were doing exactly the thing you're saying. They would go from region to region, from castle to castle, and tell their stories in song. Absolutely.
And also you had other traditions like the griots in the American South Africans. They had the tradition in South Carolina, Georgia, and the islands. The griots would tell these very long stories and have something akin to what you're...
Exactly. Others?
You offered us one quotation from Wagner from the opera and drama about, the thing about myth is all true. But while you were talking, I was thinking of another quote, which is the very first sentence of the Art and Religion. The thing about that art will give you the underlying meaning where you think it's literally true in the religion. And I don't know the exact quote, but you're familiar with that.
Yes. And your point is?
Well, just that sort of, does that relate to what you were talking about?
Yeah. A very good case could be made that what Wagner really did was use his art to create a new myth. So for him, art and myth were very closely connected to one another. And we see some evidences of it in that essay, and then also in opera and drama. Next question, yes?
And when you say professional storytellers, do you mean that they got paid for it when you say professional?
Absolutely. Typically, a minimum period of training was 12 years. That was standard. And many times they were taken when they were young, and they were only 7 or 8 years old, and they would go to what would amount to storytelling training. They took it very seriously. And the reason why they did is, without storytelling, they had no communal memory that could go from generation to generation. This was not just fun and games. This was crucial for cultural continuity. So they're very, very intense and very, very focused in terms of how they did this.
It's not be the right time to ask this, but since you're talking about the broad mythological definitions, did you, in your analysis, refer to any of the ideas of like James Fraser, the Golden Bough, the idea?
Oh, absolutely.
Myths are like they're derived from ancient like fertility rituals and things like that. Specifically, there's a book in the 19th century by Jesse Weston called
Absolutely, yeah.
Bridgewater Romance.
Yeah.
Oh, I guess I jumped ahead there.
Well, no. The thing about the Golden Bough book is that book really brings out the idea of the wounded king creates the wasteland. But that's not the only thing that he's doing in that book, but that's a big part of it. And that's a huge part of the Grail legend. Yeah. Other questions? Then let's go on. Another quote from Wagner. A letter to, his would-be paramour. But I cannot choose to work on such a broad scale as Wolfram was able to do. I have to compress everything into 3 climactic situations of violent intensity so that the work's profound and rarefied content emerges clearly and distinctly. For my art consists in working and representing things in this way. Let's dive in. How did Wagner adapt characters? This is between Wolfgang von Eschenbach and his libretto. Well, to begin with, he massively reduced the number of characters. Wolfgang had 10 major characters and over 60 minor characters. Altogether, Wolfgang has 80 named characters in his story. Wagner didn't have time for that. So he got rid of characters. He reduced them. He also combined characters into composites. And then finally, one character he expands greatly for his own narrative purposes. We begin with Gurnemans. Gurnemans is a composite character. In Eschenbach, there are 2 characters. First, there's Gurnemans with the same name as Wagner, but this Gurnemans is different. He occurs early in the story. He only trains Parsifal in the rules of etiquette for chivalry and the art of war. He knows nothing about the Grail. He's only in the story for a short while, then he disappears. There's another character in Wolfram, and that is Resonant. He appears late in the story. He is the brother of Anfortas, and he is a hermit who brings Parsifal to a place of compassion, repentance, spiritual growth, renewal. Then there are some invented roles that Wagner does. There are various Grail Knights in Eschenbach that in some ways he's taken different elements of them, Wagner has, and merged them into the character of Gurnemans. In addition, there's a castle guard in Eschenbach. It's the castle guard that calls Parsifal a goose. Remember in the first act, what does Gurnemans say to Parsifal? Calls him a goose, remember? That's a line from the castle guard in Eschenbach. In addition, Gurnemans serves a very special role that mythologists call a psychopomp. And a psychopomp is someone who takes a person from the everyday world and leads them into the other world, into the fairy tale world or the magical world or the eternal world. So there are 2 different times, both in Act 1 and again in Act 3, when Wagner's Gurnemans functions as a psychopomp. In addition, Wagner's character ages and grows. He actually functions in the first act more like Eschenbach's Gurnemans, and in the last act functions more like Eschenbach's Treversant. You may recall that in the third act, Gurnemans suddenly is a hermit living off by himself. He is more now embodying the role of Treversant. Let's look at Amfortas and Klingzor. Amfortas, oh, by the way, Anfortas, see, this is the trick. Wagner changed the spelling. In Eschenbach, he's Anfortas with an N. In Wagner, he's Amfortas with an M. In Eschenbach and in Wagner, the two are quite similar, an fortis and am fortis. But the difference is how they came to be wounded, and this is crucial. In Eschenbach, an fortis is wounded in the thigh when he goes out as a young man on an adventure to find love. And he encounters a pagan knight, and the two of them fight, and the pagan knight's lance wounds him in the thigh. By the way, in biblical and medieval language, the thigh is never the thigh. Do I need to say any more? Okay. So what it means is, an fortis's procreative power is nullified by the pagan knight. When they remove the tip of the pagan knight's lance from an fortis's thigh, on the tip is written, the Grail. Oh, so that's Eschenbach. Now in Wagner, an fortis is wounded not in the thigh, but in the side. And he's not wounded by a pagan knight. He's wounded by Klingsor, using the very spear that had been used to pierce the side of Christ when Christ hung dying on the cross. So in Eschenbach wants to give an fortis this sense of being the wounded king who turns his kingdom into a wasteland because he's lost his procreative power. But in Wagner, the wound is in the side from the same spear of Christ, so an fortis is like a suffering Christ figure. So you see they fulfill different kinds of roles. There's also a difference. In Eschenbach, an fortis's error is simply a mistake. It's an ethical failing, and that's it. Oh, but in Wagner, an fortis's mistake is much more than that. It's a corruption. His entire being is now heinous. He's now fallen from grace, and he's now completely corrupted with sin and degradation. So Wagner very, very much intensifies what happens to an fortis. Both of them want to die, both in Eschenbach and in Wagner, but for different reasons. In Eschenbach, an fortis wants to die to escape pain. In Wagner, an fortis wants to die to escape guilt. It's a very big difference. Let's look at Klingsor now. Klingsor in Wagner is a greatly, greatly expanded character. In Eschenbach, Klingsor never appears personally in the story, never. He's named. He creates a castle of marbles. And in this castle of marbles, he has enchanted 800 knights and 800 ladies who stay forever in the castle of marbles. How can we say this delicately? They're being continuously intimate with one another, but without love. It's heartless. What's even worse about the enchantment is they don't know they're enchanted. They think everything is wonderful. There is one person who escapes the enchantment. We'll talk about that later. Parsifal with a Z. That's in Eschenbach. Parsifal never goes to the Castle of Marbles in Eschenbach, and he never meets Klingsor. But Gawain does. We'll talk about Gawain in a moment. In Eschenbach, there are two heroes. There's Parsifal and Gawain. And in Eschenbach, Gawain does go to the Castle of Marbles, but Parsifal never does. So this is who Klingsor is in Eschenbach. But in Wagner, Klingsor is a failed Grail knight. He could not maintain chastity just from his own willpower, so he ends up mutilating himself in the hopes of killing his desire. This is considered horrendous to the Grail community, and they throw him out. Now he's bitter and vengeful, and he wants to entrap as many Grail knights as possible in the hope of one day coming in possession of the Grail itself. Amfortas and Klingsorg are opposing characters in Wagner, are opposing characters in Eschenbach who never meet. They never meet. That's true. They never meet in Wagner either, but they have some surprising similarities. To begin with, they both are wounded. Secondly, they both, through their wounds, oppress the community around them. Klingsorg through an enchantment, Amfortas through, call it depression. They both are obsessed with healing their wound, but in different ways. Amfortas by death, Klingsorg by revenge. They both co-opt another person. Their pain is so great that it gets projected onto another person. In the case of Amfortas with Wagner, it's Parsifal. In the case of Klingsorg, it's Kundry. Now let's look at Kundry and Parsifal. Both of these are also composite characters. Let's look at Parsifal in Wagner. In Wagner, Parsifal is a composite of two characters in Eschenbach. I just named them. That would be Parsifal, who it was his duty to heal the wounded masculine, to heal Amfortas. And also Gawain, in Eschenbach, it was his duty to heal the wounded feminine, Orgeluse. We'll get to her in a moment. She's a feminine character in Eschenbach. She doesn't appear by name in Wagner, but we'll talk about that in a moment. So in Eschenbach, there are two heroes that follow somewhat parallel experiences, but in a different way. There's Parsifal and Gawain. Wagner takes these two characters and puts them together into one person. Economy, he has to. He doesn't have time to have 10 major characters and 60 minor characters. So he combines characters. And even though they are two different characters, their traits in Eschenbach and their storylines are so similar that Parsifal in Wagner is a very coherent character. That's Parsifal in Wagner. Now let's look at Kundry. In Eschenbach, Parsifal interacts with 7 different women. His mother, Hetzeloida, a royal woman, Jeshuta, his cousin, Siguna, the woman who becomes his wife, Kadur Amor, an enchanted woman that he never meets, but Gawain meets, Orgeluse, the woman also called the Loathly Maiden, Kundry de Sorcerer, and then finally the head Grail Maiden, Rapunzel de Shoya. All of these women interact with Parsifal. All of them have their own story. We'll talk about that later. Wagner takes all 7 of these women and they become one woman. They become Kundry. In addition, he puts in some other women. Herodias, Mary Magdalene, the universal damaged woman. All of them together get put into Kundry. What this means is Kundry is the most complex character in the opera because she's carrying more different characters in Eschenbach. Let's take a moment and remind you about source criticism and one of the things that it does. It exposes ideological and psychological shifts, and it deepens interpretation without lessening artistry. So now let's look very closely at the women in Eschenbach and compare them to Kundry in Wagner. To begin with, the women in Eschenbach are all embedded in a rich social matrix. They have friends, they have family, they have ex-lovers, maybe they have a current lover, they have a husband, they have a whole world of relationships around them. In Wagner, Kundry is an isolated outcast. In Eschenbach, all of the women are emotionally sovereign. They have their own feelings and they express them in their own way, and their feelings are always coherent and appropriate for the situation. For example, the Lothly Maiden, at one point in Eschenbach's story, catches Parsifal off guard when he's about to be made a part of the Round Table and castigates him for failing to ask the compassionate question when he was in the Grail castle. She is furious with him, and it turns out she's furious with him for good reason. Her emotions are coherent and contextually appropriate. On the other hand, Kundry in Wagner is compulsive and chaotic. Her emotions are everywhere and nowhere. They go all over the place and go nowhere. In Eschenbach, all of the women are narratively autonomous. What this means is they have their own storylines. Yes, they appear in the story to move Parsifal's story further. That's a common thing to happen, right? But they have their own stories separate from Parsifal. And more importantly, when Parsifal's story culminates, their stories continue. It's not like their lives suddenly end. Oh, but Kundry in Wagner is only reactive and only constrained to whatever is happening in the moment. In addition, in Eschenbach, all of the women are coping strategically. Let me give you an example. Orgellusa is in the Castle of Marvels. She's the one character in Eschenbach that is the closest to Wagner's Kundry because, like Kundry in Wagner, she also is bewitched. She's under the control of an evil sorcerer. However, in Eschenbach, when Gawain the hero appears, Orgellusa has already freed herself from Klingzor. She doesn't need a hero to free her from his grips. She has freed herself already. Now she has lingering damage from the enchantment, and Gawain participates in that healing. Oh, but here's how he does it. Orgellusa sends him as a challenge into the Castle of Marvels, where he must endure the mythic bed that spins at night. The arrows come out of the walls, the swords come out of the walls, a lion attacks Gawain in the middle of the night. If Gawain endures all of that and never leaves the bed, it is Gawain who is healed, not Orgellusa. How is he healed? He understands her damage. He understands her wounds. And once he does that, that's enough. Orgellusa doesn't need somebody to heal her. But in Wagner, Kundry is mythically doomed. There's no way out for her. If she's going to have a way out, someone's going to have to do it for her. And finally, in Eschenbach, all of the women re-enter their ordinary lives as the story is summing up. But in Wagner, Kundry is extinguished. So when we look at source criticism and we compare the two sources, this is what stands out. Now, questions? Yes?
I have a trivial question, but is one of the 7 women in Eschenbach the mother of Lohengrin?
Yes, Kadura Moore is the mother of Lohengrin. Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah, my question, you told us source criticism. I was thinking, does that mean that Eschenbach is related, to the Arthurian legend for physical weighing, and there's the wounded king, and there's Kundry, or the other was equivalent to Morgana? And if so, how do these come together?
Okay. What's good to know is the Arthurian legend is not just a single story with Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. It's a whole universe, a whole collection of stories. the story of Parsifal is a part of the, let's call it, Arthurian family of legends or stories. I think many people sort of assume there's a sword in the stone legend, right, with Arthur, and that's it, there are no others. No, there's a whole family. For that matter, Tristan and Isolde is a part of the Arthurian family of legends. So
The thief when pulling out,
excuse me?
the thief when pulling out the sword is also connected with the throne.
Yeah, we don't really have time to deal with Sigurd in this particular presentation. That particular part of the ring cycle actually harkens back to earlier mythological themes, but other than saying that, we don't really have time to deal with that particular issue. Yes, sir.
There's a book entitled The Redeemer Reborn by Paul Schofield, and he delves into the idea, into the relationship between Parsifal, in his view, the relationship between Parsifal and the ring cycle. And he theorizes that Parsifal is the fifth.
Oh, yes, I've seen his work. Yeah.
Do you have any perspective on Wagner's incorporation of Buddhism and the Schopenhauer philosophy into Parsifal?
Yes, I do. And the incorporation of Buddhist themes is going back more to that idea of the dominant religion and then subdominant religions being heterodox. And heterodox means you got a mix of different things coming in together. And so Wagner in his opera uses some Christian mysticism, uses some Buddhist ideas, uses some other elements and brings them together. My focus in this particular presentation is somewhat in other areas. By the way, that theory of Parsifal being the fifth opera in the ring cycle, whether or not that holds together on its own merits, here's how it functions anyway. Remember, I said that storytellers string stories together willy-nilly, apparently willy-nilly. But once you put one after another, an alert audience begins to say, oh, wait a minute, I see some connections here. And so at the very least, it's happening on that level.
Wouldn't another external source for Kundry outside the myths be Ahasuerus, the wandering Jew who was...
Absolutely.
That's actually explicitly in the piece, isn't it? It's more or less...
Yeah, that's in the third act. Yes, it comes out. Absolutely. Yes.
So just to go back what he asked before, so Lohengrin is in the Van Essenbach book. He's mentioned in there?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I didn't know.
Yeah. Lohengrin is mentioned. However, he receives no storyline whatsoever. Nothing. He's only named. Lohengrin is one of those stories that flowers later, more into the 14th and 15th century. Much later, it becomes fleshed out into a full narrative.
And if you want to take source criticism to the next stage, I can't remember a production of Parsifal in the last 15 years where Kundry actually dies at the end. That's been sort of written out.
Yeah. I just rewatched Bayreuth's production. It's got a very, very different end. But this is our received text. Yeah. Others?
From a feminist perspective, it would seem that Wagner would be giving much less agency to women overall than Eschenbach. So I was wondering, to what extent have you reviewed any kind of feminist criticism of Parsifal or Wagner in general?
My expertise doesn't lie in feminist thought.
It seems like you have much less agency. You can yourself.
Yeah. This is a matter if you use source criticism as a tool and you look at the text. In this case, this is a conclusion you come to. In comparing the two texts, the women in Eschenbach have far more agency than Kundry does here.
Yeah. In Eschenbach, is there a character that identifies or knows Parsifal's mother? And if so, is that also incorporated into Kundry in some way?
Yeah, there are two characters in Eschenbach that know Parsifal's mother. One is his cousin Sigune, she would know his family. And the other one is Contre la Sorcière, the Lovely Maiden. She actually has also some similarities to Kundry in that she has some witch-like qualities, meaning the ability to know things that other people don't know and to be places that doesn't quite line up. How can she be in all these different places?
He's also a time traveler.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Von Eschenbach, I said it was 15,000 words.
50,000 lines.
Lines.
Yes.
And I presume this is in German.
It's in Mittelhochdeutsch. It's right here.
And Wagner, the Parsifal is in German. How many words were there in von Eschenbach relative to the number of words in Wagner's Parsifal? That would give us a metric showing how much compression he had to do.
That's a very good question. I've not done a word count on either of those, but it's got to be massive, a massive contraction.
10 to 1?
8 to 1, 10 to 1, yeah, I would think so. It's massive. And the quote that I read from you, Wagner said, I have to compress. Eschenbach had the leisure, in a sense, Eschenbach's story is this long, leisurely, rambling, chivalric story with many, many side stories, many, many secondary, tertiary characters, very leisurely. He kind of wanders all over the landscape, taking his time. And Wagner says, I don't have that kind of time. I got to go.
Well, the parallel I'm thinking about is the illuminating, which is again a little later than Eschenbach, going back to the Icelandic Edda. And the Icelandic Edda ended with the women are armed, like the scene with Brynhild.
Yeah.
I mean, that could never have happened because all the women have swords
Yeah.
in the and certainly in the Icelandic Edda, all the women are armed. They killed people all over.
Yes. Yeah, that's a completely different mythic stream in Europe, yes.
So does Tannhäuser appear at any time in von Eschenbach?
No,
But I should want to present that.
so the Tannhäuser is an interesting story in that Tannhäuser is not a part of the Arthurian cycle of stories. Tannhäuser is an example of a kind of mythogenesis when a very potent, memorable character exists in society, dies, and then later a legend is created around him. In other words, there really was a historical Tannhäuser, and he really was a mini-Sänger. He never went to the Gralsberg, to Venusberg, but after he died, about 100 years after he died, this legend grew up around this story independently. So that's a different kind of source and a different kind of creation of the myth. Okay, let's move on because we have a plot to get into. How Wagner adapted plot. Well, I've already mentioned it just a moment ago. Wagner omitted copious amounts of plot. It just was impossible. He couldn't ramble all over the real estate like Eschenbach did. He introduced 2 fairy tale motifs in order to make his new, more constricted plot work. Here's what it is. There's 2 plot problems and 2 plot solutions. Wagner reduces 80 characters down to 5. These are really powerful, potent, memorable, engaging characters. He's got them in a vivid landscape. The magical garden and the Grail castle. Well, but how are they going to know each other? How are they going to interact? Right now, he's got a problem. He's got 5 characters just sitting in a landscape with no real reason to be interacting with each other. So what he does is, he takes a fairy tale. He takes the plot from a fairy tale and he inserts it into the story in order to make everything work. He uses ATU 302, the Bewitched Princess, and I'll talk about this in a moment, in order to hold the plot together. In addition, Wagner rejected Eschenbach's use of the compassionate question. You may or may not be familiar with that. In Eschenbach's version of the story, there's a test for Parsifal. He must ask the wounded king a compassionate question. He must do it on his own. If he does it, the king is healed and the kingdom is restored. Parsifal doesn't. He fails. Wagner looked at that test and said, that's just not workable. It makes no sense. So he doesn't use that test. Here's what he said. I had to make a completely fresh start with Parsifal. For Wolfram hadn't the faintest idea what he was doing. The thing about the question is that it is so utterly preposterous and totally meaningless. I should simply have to invent everything here. So what Wagner does is he rejects Eschenbach's way of fulfilling it, but he uses the same storyline, a fairy tale structure called the one necessary thing, ATU 480. What ATU is the Arne-Thompson-Uther system. It's a system that fairy tale folklorists, philologists have used to categorize fairy tales based on plot elements. Not the names of the characters or the setting, but how does the storyline move? And they found ways to categorize it and give each one a number. So the story may be the same in Finland and Turkey and in Siberia. Maybe the characters are different, the setting is different, but the story is the same. It gets the same ATU number. You see? That's a system. Wagner uses ATU 302 in order to make his plot work. Here's what the Bewitched Princess is. The plot line for the Bewitched Princess is as follows. There's a princess. In the daytime, she's wonderful. Maybe a little distant, a little moody, a little troubled, but she's fine. She's also amazingly beautiful. She attracts suitors. When they arrive, she gives them a series of 3 tests, 3 questions. She gets the first question at night when the princess sleeps. She becomes enchanted. She flies through the air to the mountain lair of a dark sorcerer. There from the sorcerer, she gets the question to be posed of the suitor the next day. She asks the suitor the question. If he fails, if he gets it right, she repeats. She goes back to the mountain lair of the dark sorcerer, gets the second question, and so forth. What happens is the hero, finally a suitor who arrives, who is the hero. He realizes something's up. He finds a way to fly through the air using some magical power of his own, to go to the lair of the dark sorcerer and learn the answer to the 3 questions. The story ends by him following and going with the princess each time, and the 3rd time he kills the dark sorcerer and thereby breaks the enchantment. This is the Bewitched Princess, ATU 302. Wagner uses the structure, the storyline of the Bewitched Princess in order to link Kundry with both worlds, with the Grail world and with the magical garden world. When Kundry is awake, she's normal, kind of troubled, but she's okay. She's in the Grail world. But when she falls asleep, she undergoes the enchantment. Now she's in the magical garden. There are hints of this in the first act. You may remember in the first act, Kundry says, I'm so tired, I must sleep. And then what does she say? No, 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 anything but sleep, no. Why? When she sleeps, suddenly she's there, under the enchantment. In addition, the other hint is, Gornamance finally challenges her. Why do all the bad things happen to us when you're gone? Remember that line? That's because she's asleep and she's under Klingsor's power in the other garden, you see. Wagner uses ATU 302, and this is the crucial structural move for Wagner. Without this, he has no plot that holds together. With it, suddenly, he has a plot that works. Now, there's one way in which Wagner changes ATU 302. In ATU 302, the hero always breaks the enchantment by killing the dark sorcerer, either by cutting off his head or sometimes by crushing his heart. Oh, but Wagner, at the end of Act 2, Parsifal uses the spear to kill Klingzor? No, only to break the spell and cause the enchanted garden to collapse. Otherwise, Parsifal leaves Klingzor untouched. The difference between the two is, in ATO 302, the hero is a killer. He kills the dark sorcerer. But in Wagner, I guess you could say he's a pacifist. He doesn't kill. Now, Wagner uses another fairy tale to move the plot forward. He uses ATU 480. This is a fairy tale that's called The One Necessary Thing. Here's the way it works. The most well-known telling of this is the Frau Höhle story in the German culture. Here's what happens. There's a lovely young girl, kind of almost like a Cinderella type, put upon by her family, misunderstood, sort of downtrodden. One day she finds a well, and she looks down in the well. She sees something shining down in it, so she dives in. And she comes out the other side in another world. She walks through this world. It's amazing and beautiful beyond anything she's ever seen. She comes to an apple tree. It's groaning with apples. The limbs are bending downward. All of the limbs are about to break. The tree itself cries out to her, says, "Oh, help us, we're about to break." So she harvests all the apples and puts them in baskets, and the tree thanks her. Then she goes on. She comes upon a big oven, a big wood-burning oven, and in it are many loaves of bread. They're just at the exact moment of completion. They're done, but they all cry out, "Oh, please take us out, or we'll burn." She takes them all out, puts them off to one side to cool. She finally arrives at a weird cottage built into a tree trunk, and she goes inside. Nobody's there, but in the bedroom, the bed is not made. All the covers are all messed up and unwrinkled, and she says, "That'll never do," and she makes the bed. At that moment, Frau Höhle appears. By the way, in German fairy tales, Frau Höhle is like the Earth Mother, the Earth Goddess. She appears and says basically, because you've been such a good girl, and you helped the apple tree, and you took the loaves out of the oven, and you made my bed, now you get all this gold. That's the one necessary thing. Notice the girl does all of those things without being told. Just out of the natural goodness of her heart, she realizes, this is not right, I should do something. And she does the necessary thing. She does the right thing. Wagner dispenses with Eschenbach's way of implementing the one necessary thing in his story, but he doesn't do away with the story itself. Instead, he implements it in a different way and more than once. So, the first implementation of it is in the first act with the killing of the swan. Parsifal comes into the enchanted realm of the Grail castle, and the beautiful swan flies overhead. He should just instinctively know. Leave a beautiful living creature alone. But does he do it? No, he kills it. So in other words, the first one necessary thing Parsifal fails at and is rebuked by Gurnemetz. But that's not the only one. Then, in the second act, when Kundry tries to seduce him without being told to resist her, he does it, and actually, it would seem that he does it because he realizes by giving in to her seductions, he's taking advantage of her. She doesn't appear to be in her right mind. So he has compassion on her and does not give in to her seductions. Then finally, next, in the third act, there are two necessary things. He carries the spear, and even though he is repeatedly attacked, he never uses the spear to defend himself, nor does he ever use it to attack anyone. He carries it without ever using it. And by doing that, he expiates the corruption or the fouling of the spear that Klingsor had put upon it, because Klingsor did use it to attack somebody. He used it to attack Amfortas. Finally, Parsifal accepts and takes upon himself the curse of Kundry. Who talked about the Wandering Jew? Yeah. At the end of the second act, Kundry places his Wandering Jew curse upon Parsifal. And in the third act, when he returns, we discover he bore that curse without complaint or impatience, and by doing it, he expiated, he healed the curse that had been laid upon Kundry. Here's the German near the end of the second act that Kundry uses. She's speaking to Parsifal. She says, "Und flühest du von hier und fändest alle Wege der Welt, den Weg, den du suchst, des Pfades sollst du nicht finden, den Pfaden Wege, die dich mit entführen, so verwünsche ich sie dir. Ihre. What she's saying here is, oh, you can flee from me, and you can try to find all the ways in the world, but you will never find that path. Every path, every way that takes you away from me and away from my curse, so verwünsche ich, oh, that's a really powerful verb in German, I curse you. And ihre has a double meaning. Ihre means be lost, go astray, never find your way, but it also means go absolutely crazy, lose your mind. You're going to be totally psychotic. Kundry puts this curse upon him, and in the third act, this is what Parsifal says. Der Irrnis in den Leiden Pfad komme ich. Soll ich mich denen jetzt entwöhnen wähnen, doch ach, den Weg des Heiles nicht zu finden, in fahrlosen Irren trieb ein wilde Flücht mich umher, zahllose Nüte, Kämpfer und Streiter zwangen mich ab vom Pfade, wenn ich ihn recht schon erkannt. What he's saying here is, I tried and tried and tried to find the right path, but every time I did, it ran away from me. And I was attacked on all sides. There were fights and arguments and battles at every hand, and I was under extreme distress. I was absolutely forced away from the right path, and I had to endure it. For Wagner, ATU 480 is the crucial energetic move. With AT 302, he has a structure that will hold the plot together. But how are you going to build the intensity throughout the whole story? Wagner uses ATU 480 again and again in ever more intense ways to build the energy in the plot and move it to a conclusion. Questions?
How do we know about the Wandering Jew in Eschenbach?
Oh, good question. The Wandering Jew does not appear in Eschenbach. The Wandering Jew was simply a story that began circulating in Europe during the Middle Ages. It was an anti-Semitic story, but it was well known, and Wagner knew of it, so he incorporated the Wandering Jew element from a different source, not from Eschenbach. Other questions? Yes.
Two parts. The first one, the 304, whatever.
Yeah.
Isn't aspects of that is off point, but isn't also that in Toronto? The answer gets the three questions and the suitor.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. The whole idea of a beautiful woman who's deadly, like a femme fatale, and three tests is a very, very universal fairy tale theme, legend, saga theme, repeats in many, many different cultures.
So to the other one, the way you just presented, the 480, maybe I don't see that when killing the swan, that escalation that you said, I don't see how those are they the same kind of thing? Like killing a swan is like one aspect that I would like. There's his awareness of compassion. So killing the swan, he's dimly aware, and then he sees the suffering, doesn't ask the question in Act 2 and then Act 3. So that arc I understand, and that's the way I'm used to looking at it. But this fairy tale template, I'm not sure I see how those connect. If you could expand on it.
Yeah, they connect in the sense that, and actually I did mention it earlier. Well, I did mention it earlier, but not in this context. There are actually two necessary things in the second act, because taking the spear from Klingsor but not killing him with it was also a one necessary test. So one way that it is intensified is there's more than one test happening at the same time. So in Act 3, for example, Parsifal must simultaneously bear two necessary things, not use the spear to defend himself and bear Kundry's curse. So that's part of the intensification. Same thing in Act 2. But also, the implications of the failure become greater and greater. So in the first act, if he kills a swan, that's sad, but it's just a swan. If he gives in to Kundry's temptation in the second act, now maybe the Grail comes in possession of Klingsor. So you see there's more and more at stake with each intensification. By the way, the same thing happens with the original fairy tale, with the apple tree, with the bread, with the bed. Each one may seem on the same plane, they're actually becoming more and more intense. The reason is they're moving closer and closer to Frau Höhle. And this is true in all fairy tales and all legends. The closer you get to the Earth Mother, the more dangerous everything becomes. So, other questions?
Remind me what anew is.
That's the Arne-Thompson-Uther system of categorizing fairy tales. A number is assigned to every plot structure, and these plots repeat, like he already noticed with Turandot. They repeat in many different places, many different cultures.
When was it devised?
Excuse me?
When was it devised, this system?
Oh, well, it has three different names because it was devised over time. First by Arndt, then by Thompson, then by Uther, continuously updated, improved, expanded. It began in the late 1800s and was developed throughout the 20th century.
So, but Thompson is an Anglo-Saxon, the other two are Germans or Dutch. So they're taking not just German, but maybe all the Northern European fairy tales.
That's where they started, yes. But they were studying fairy tales from all over the world, even though their own cultural context was Northern Europe, or Central Europe. They weren't only studying European fairy tales. Yeah. Others? Okay. Let's deal with Wagner's special language that he uses in his opera. Wagner uses the modern German of his day, but then he does something really powerful with it. He inserts many archaic expressions. And in doing this, he creates a hybrid language that sounds both ancient and timeless. Let me give you one example. Here's an excerpt from Gurnemann's speech in Act 1. Don't worry about what the German is. Gibt es hier jemanden, der Deutsch kann? Okay, well then maybe you can read it. It doesn't matter. This is just the text. Now, I'm going to show you another slide, and all the text in red, these are all the archaic expressions that Wagner is using in the text. What happens is he has created a kind of hybrid language. It's not really the language of his day. He uses enough of the language of his day that the people of his day can understand it. But it is so filled with other expressions, it's become a different kind of language. Wagner uses many different sources. He uses the Luther Bible of 1534. He uses Luther's Small Catechism of 1529. He uses language from church hymns, from Lutheran sermonic style, from Catholic sacramentalism, from legendary or chronicle diction. He uses poetic elesion. He uses incantatory compounding. He puts lots of words together to make a kind of magical incantation sound. Let me give you one example in the German and then give you an English translation that kind of captures the archaic flavor. So this is one. This is a part of Gurneman's speech in Act 1. Den Grail auch wenn fast schon uns entwunden. And in English we would say, he verily deemed the Grail already wrested from us. You get the feel of that in English? You understand the English, but you also say, when did I ever say verily? When did I ever say wrested from us? You see? This is the feel of the language. Let me give you another example in English. This is from William Morris, a contemporary of Wagner. This is from his novel, The Well at the World's End. So he rode on that day and the next, and on the third day he came to a country fair and pleasant and well peopled, and he wondered much at the folk thereof, for they were tall and comely, and clad in goodly raiment, and courteous of speech and of good fellowship, and they bade him welcome in a friendly wise, and were glad of his coming. You get the feel? This is what Wagner's doing with the German. Every bit as much. In fact, he's doing much more than that, because this text in English is only using kind of medieval courtly language, but Wagner is using a lot of religious terms, a lot of liturgical language that really intensifies everything. For example, here's some true medieval German. This is from Eschenbach. For those of you who know a little German, I can't either.
What are the circumflexes?
Those were indications of vowel sounds. They had different vowel sounds in 12th century German. Here's the effect of Wagner's language. He creates a comprehensive aesthetic liturgical register. It exerts authority without him having to claim it. In other words, he doesn't have to say, oh, would you please come with me to another time and place? I have a new world to show to you. No, the language comes at you, and he claims it, and there you are. He creates a sense of being outside of ordinary time, because it's like your familiar language, but not like it. It's both and. He gives the text gravitas with mythical overtones. And then on top of it all, Wagner has leitmotif with words, not just with music. So he intensifies it even more with the leitmotif. Some of the core leitmotif are die Wunde, the wound, or Blut, blood, or Herz, heart, or brennen or brand, burning, or Mitleid, compassion, or Erlösung, redemption or redeemer. These words reappear in different settings. They migrate between different characters. Their meaning evolves and intensifies as it's being used throughout the opera. So just like Wagner has a leitmotif with music, he has leitmotif with language. Now, there's a singular departure There's one moment in the opera when Wagner drops the archaic aesthetic register and speaks only in regular, everyday German. There's only one sentence in the whole opera. Remember, source criticism not only compares the received with the source text, but it also looks in the received text for changes in register. Can you guess what it is? It's at the end of Act 2. Du weißt, wo du mich wiederfinden kannst. Suddenly, Parsifal speaks in just regular, everyday German. It would be exactly the same kind of thing that a 19th century German might have said to his wife when he got on the train. Du weißt, wo du mich wiederfinden kannst. Now, from a source criticism standpoint, this one line in the opera has had many, many interpretations, has it not? Maybe you have your own favorite interpretation. But from a source criticism standpoint, it really comes down to there's one prominent way that source criticism, in light of what Wagner's doing with the language and how he suddenly drops it, what is happening here is, for a moment, Parsifal steps out of the other world, and suddenly he's just a normal human being. He's just himself. And he accepts the curse from Kundry not as some sort of mythic compulsion that he has no choice in, that he's driven to do, but he accepts it as a conscious, personal choice. Now in Act 3, the opera goes right back into the archaic aesthetic register and never returns. Okay, questions? Yes.
William Morris's that paragraph from the very late 19th century. That is not how people spoke.
Absolutely not. No, they didn't. No.
It would seem as still to the late 19th century as it does to us. So, in all the words you heard and read, that was most of the text. Most of it, it's like that Old English. You can't understand Old English, Middle English, well, maybe. How could they possibly understand it? Like, most of the vocabulary was archaic.
Well,
Far more than in that paragraph from William Morris, where maybe only a fifth of it was archaic.
part of it is context. For example, William Morris, his stories were almost like modern fairy tales, modern for his time. They were about knights in the Middle Ages. So if you bought a book of William Morris to read it, you were the kind of person who liked fantasy, and you were going to expect that kind of language. Secondly, what it really calls for is an educated audience that remembers archaic expressions. Probably many of you would recognize expressions, even if you would say, wow, we don't talk that way anymore. And this is what would be happening in Wagner.
Well,
they would recognize and understand, but they would also know, we don't talk like that anymore.
Could I just suggest the music would also help? I mean, there's always sort of, it repeats, it changes, it gives meaning to the words.
Well, yeah. We're doing something here different today. We're looking only at the words, but of course, it's a musical opera. Yeah.
I was just going to say, an example would be Shakespeare in English.
Yeah.
The many lines that you remember, they mean that they don't.
Like bootless crimes.
Yeah.
Yeah, Shakespeare is old enough that you need a lexicon. Other questions? Yes.
How would you interpret that final question from Act 2, and that final line from Act 2, in light of the mythological framework you talked about? Like, what would be the best interpretation of device for
Yeah, I just gave it.
to carry the curse.
Yeah, carrying the curse, because it's not exactly the last thing that Kundry. Oh no, that's true. It is the last thing that Kundry says to Parsifal. She does turn and call Klingsor to come attack Parsifal, but she's not speaking to Parsifal when she says that. She's speaking to Klingsor. So the last thing that Kundry says to Parsifal is, "Ich verwünsche dich, ihre." So that's not to say that's the only way that that sentence could be interpreted. I'm offering it to the group tonight. This would be something that would have a kind of logical inference when you're using a source critical method.
But it doesn't fit into ATU for baby in any way, right? It's not.
No, something very, very radical is happening here. I'll tell you what's happening here. It's something like what happens in the Synoptic Gospels in the Greek New Testament. The New Testament was written in Koine Greek, but there comes a point in Matthew, Mark, and Luke when Jesus is hanging on the cross where suddenly he says, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani." He suddenly switches to Aramaic. It's the only place it happens in any of those three Gospels. Exactly the same thing is happening there. When, in a sense, what's happening is the storyline is dropped, and what you have is a suffering human being, just a suffering human being, in Jesus, I mean. In Parsifal, what you have is, for a moment, the myth is dropped. This is from a source critical standpoint, you understand. And you just have Parsifal accepting somebody else's suffering. Yes.
So Wagner used archaic language in The Ring, too, right?
Absolutely, but a different kind.
Was that the first time? I mean, he didn't use it in his earlier operas, did he? Archaic.
No, well, in The Ring, he used archaic language from the Nordic tradition. You know, the alliteration that he's oftentimes made so fun of. That was his way of making an artistic, aesthetic register in that particular set of operas, using that.
But I mean, I'm just saying, that's the first time he started using archaic language. I don't know, large scale.
No. We see it happening. I mean, this was part of Wagner's methodology. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Others?
So we're sure Wagner read von Eschenbach, and not just read him, but studied him so he knew von Eschenbach inside and out.
Yeah, I would say two things about it. Yes, we know that he read Eschenbach, but actually, we don't need to know that from a source critical standpoint. We just look at Eschenbach, and then we look at Wagner, and you see it right there.
I think this archaic language component is really important and very interesting, and not something I really thought about so much. And I was always told that Wagner, made up words to create the poetry, to create rhyme, and so I'm just wondering how much of the language and the story and the words is really nothing more than fiction to fit with music in the Gesamtkunstwerk.
Yeah. There are words in Parsifal that Wagner made up. He did it in a typical Germanic style. You could probably guess what it is. You put two words together. There's quite a bit of that. But it's not only that. There are a lot of words that he is getting from other sources. Anyone else? Okay, we're going to go on. One thing that the source critical method will show is changes in ideology and psychology. I'm calling this the Wagnerian shift when comparing Eschenbach with Wagner. What happens with Wagner in comparison to Eschenbach is it goes from outer to inner. Outer narrative story, inner psychology. It goes from narrative to ritual. Eschenbach is his long, meandering, chivalric narrative. Wagner has storyline, but it's been ritualized. There's many ritual actions. And In addition, it goes from finite to cosmic. In Eschenbach, you get the sense that you're just dealing with everyday people struggling with everyday problems. But with Wagner, you get this sense that the whole universe is at stake in terms of what's happening here. Let's do this by comparing An fortis in Eschenbach with Am fortis in Wagner. This is some of the medieval German in Eschenbach. We won't worry about that. Let me give you the English translation. An fortis, the Lord of the Grail, lay so grievously because of his wound that no physician could help him any longer. His body grew sick from great suffering. His heart was torn apart by sorrow. So this is An fortis in Eschenbach. Notice what's happening here. An fortis' suffering is observed and described from the outside. It's not An fortis expressing it himself. The narrator is describing it. Notice that his suffering is limited. It's limited to his body. Look at the words. It's a wound. There's a physician. There's a doctor there to help his body. His body grew sick. His heart was torn apart. The wound is ethical and limited. It's a physical ailment, and that's that. This is An fortis in Eschenbach. Now, Am fortis in Wagner is very different. Here's the German. We'll skip to the English translation. Pierced through by the most blessed pain of rapture, I feel the fountain of the holiest blood pour itself into my heart, and then the surge of my own sinful blood in frantic flight must flow back into me. How much do I need to say now about how different those are? Okay. In Wagner, the suffering is interior and felt. It's Am fortis himself describing his own inner experience of agony. In addition, in Wagner, the suffering is total. It's religious. It's sacral. And in Wagner, ecstasy and self-disgust are all-consuming. Listen what he says here. Pierced through by the most blessed pain of rapture. Okay? This is very, very all-consuming. So, for clarity's sake, in Eschenbach, we have a narrative. In Wagner, we have much, much more of a ritual. Eschenbach tells a story. Wagner enacts a ritual. In Eschenbach, suffering is ethical. People make mistakes, and they pay a price for it, but the mistakes are relatively limited to the everyday kind of suffering that people have in the ordinary world. But in Wagner, suffering is redemptive. Eschenbach presents moral consequences. Wagner makes suffering itself holy and redemptive. In Eschenbach, he uses courtly language. Actually, in Eschenbach, he's using the actual language of his day. He hasn't changed it at all. But Wagner has created this liturgical aesthetic register. Eschenbach writes in ordinary language. Wagner writes in cosmic timelessness. Questions?
Is Wagner lifting text from Eschenbach and using it whole in places, or is he completely reworking Eschenbach within the same theme? Going back to your point about the core of the storyteller have to stick to the core of the story, but could embellish for the audience.
I thank you for picking up on that. This is exactly what Wagner has done. He's kept the matter of the story, but he kept the matter of the story, but changed its sense. There's no evidence that any language in Eschenbach shows up in Wagner. He's completely reworked it. There's lots of evidence. You can look in the Luther Bible, you can look in the Luther Small Catechism, you can look in Roman Catholic sacramental liturgy, you can find exact terms that show up in Wagner, but you can't find that in Eschenbach.
Yeah, one thing that I noted is that apart from the language shifts, unless you're about, it's very straightforward. If you know what the words mean, look up their problem,
Yeah.
it doesn't seem like you could sing it. The Nibelungen lead has a rhythm so you can remember that.
Yeah.
But the language is straightforward. It's a whole bunch of people meeting and getting in fights and murdering their brothers and whatever. But it's simple. You can pick it up. I mean, I read it when my freshman year of college because it was a lot like Yiddish.
Yeah.
Just read it. But Wagner, you pick it up. There's all these convoluted alliterations and what is a ballad? I mean, what's the
Yeah.
It's not made up words. You wouldn't be able to just make it in just those two samples. You can see how convoluted Wagner is.
Well, musically, even with Wagner's sung music, he created a new kind of musical vocabulary in that the singers are not really singing arias and they're not really singing recitatives. It's something in between, which itself is an invitation to another world. It's sort of, there's a word called liminal. The word liminal means you're not in this world and you're not in the next world, you're somewhere in between. And even with the music, Wagner embodies that. Other questions? And let's move to summation. Wagner did not simply inherit a myth from Eschenbach. He radically reshaped it. He drew upon medieval sources. He invented fairy tale structures in strategic ways to make his plot work and make it move forward. And he invented a sacred alternative language that gave a people a sense of timelessness. And by doing so, he turns Parsifal into a narrative, from a narrative into a ritual drama, wherein suffering and ritual meaning reveal how modern myth is made. One last quote from Wagner himself. This is him once again writing to resonant. It suddenly became dreadfully clear to me, speaking about Parsifal, it suddenly became dreadfully clear to me, it is my third act Tristan inconceivably intensified. It's been my honor to be with you this evening and to accompany you for a brief while in this amazing text. Thank you for your time.